Okay, we want to look at SAT reading now, and today we're going to look at short dual passages. Now this will build off of our previous conversations about short single passages and long single passages, because there's an extra twist to these. But first, let's kind of remember what these passages look like. So these are when you have two passages about a single topic, and the topic will be related to each other in some way. It may not be identical, but they will be interconnected in each of the passages. And the passages themselves are going to have a relationship. Now the relationship can change. There's no way to necessarily know what it is beforehand. The relationship can be one passage takes one perspective and the other one takes the opposite perspective. Maybe they agree with each other and they're just reinforcing one another. Maybe one's kind of general, abstract, and gives a lot of rules about a topic or thoughts about a topic, and the other one's a specific application of those rules. And we can like see how well it was applied. Or maybe there's another relationship that would come up. But it's going to be the relationship that matters. That's the unique question that emerges on this type of passage in one of the four questions that we have after the short dual passages. What we want is we want to approach the reading of these passages just like we would the other passages. We're going to read first the whole thing like we do the other short little passage. And it's going to be usually the amount that we read for kind of the longer passages anyway, about 10 lines or so, to get an idea of what the context of a certain part of the sentence is. So instead of like reading just particular lines, we just read the whole thing from like line 1 to 10 because they're really short. They're at max 15 lines long. And we articulate the main idea of each individual passage. We'll do questions about one passage at a time. If there are any, there won't necessarily be any about one passage only. But if there are, we do those. Then we will articulate the relationship of the two passages and do the questions about the two passages at once. So let's look at a passage together. And let's go ahead and read through this. So passage 1. Many scientists tend to split the universe into two realms, science and irrationality. They believe truth is only what can be experimentally proved, and that understanding is only what fits into the straitjacket of logic. This approach may work beautifully within the scope of questions that science can answer, but life is a far richer tapestry than the threads of logic alone can weave. It is myopic to define reason so narrowly that one can't see the other threads. Science can teach us many things, but there are some truths science cannot measure. So now if you need to reread that because it's hard to read as someone else talks, pause the video and come up with what you think the main idea would be. But what the main idea is here is they're trying to describe that there's kind of something wrong with science's perspective on trying to understand the truths of the world. They're trying to say there's another truth. It's good to put main ideas into complete sentences, right? So science diminishes non-science truths, but those truths can be helpful to us. That's basically what this passage is trying to say. That there are other things beyond what science cares about that can be helpful to understanding kind of life. Okay, so you would look through the questions and see if there's any question about passage 1 only. And unfortunately, there is no question about passage 1 only, but that's what you want to do. You would answer any question about passage 1 only if there was. Then, since there is no question about passage 1 only, we'll go to passage 2. We'll read the whole thing. After spending years training in Buddhist meditative practices, neurologist James Austin got his first taste of spiritual enlightenment while waiting on the London train platform, idly glancing toward the Thames River. Instantly, the panorama of sky and buildings acquired a sense of what he calls absolute reality, intrinsic rightness, and ultimate perfection. He suddenly shed his formerly unshakable assumption that he was an individual separated from the rest of the world by a skin suit. Within seconds, other insights dawned. Austin described in a book how this experience spurred him to study brain processes that underlie spiritual experiences. But the harsh reality of science is that those who study mysticism are rarely taken seriously. For scientists, claims of mystical enlightenment have long smacked of self-deception, charlatanism, or both. Again, pause the video if you need to reread it and come up with your own main idea. But what this passage seems to be talking about is a personal case of this guy named James Austin and how he seems to have realized something kind of in a mystic way. And then the second paragraph talks about what looks like how the scientists would dismiss it. So they're related on that scientist perspective again. So the main idea here seems to focus on the idea that James Austin had a mystical experience that scientists would dismiss. And now we would do any question about passage 2 only. Again, you look. There is no question about passage 2 only, so there's nothing to do. So before we do any of the questions, though, we must articulate the relationship between the two passages. The relationship between the passages seems to be largely one of agreement. They both have a similar perspective on these scientists. They keep dismissing things that they seem to say shouldn't be dismissed. So what we could say is passage 1 states a view on scientists that passage 2 reaffirms. They basically agree with one another. That's the relationship. Yeah, they talk about slightly different details, but in general, the relationship is an agreement relationship. Now you're ready for the questions. So let's go into the questions, give them a look, and do them as we standardly would on any of the other passages. So we ignore the answer choices at first and try to predict our own answer here. So the scientists referred to in line 1, passage 1, would most likely view the book mentioned in line 21, passage 2 with, well, let's look at these. So scientists in line 1, here they said many scientists tend to split the universe into two realms. Well, these are the scientists that passage 1 seems to not like, right? And then what about that book in line 21? Austin described in a book how this experience spurred him. Well, this was the experience about his suddenly understanding the world in kind of a mystic way. Well, passage 1 told us how those scientists don't like mystic views of things. So we could probably say that the scientists in passage 1 would probably dislike the book in passage 2. So let's see what type of answers we have to consider. And let's get rid of anything that doesn't even come close to disrespect or not like, something like that. So respect, that's not a positive thing, no. Curiosity, maybe, but it's pretty far from they like it or, sorry, they dislike it. Objectivity, they wouldn't review with objectivity. Ambivalence means they don't really care. Probably not, they probably do have a perspective. Skepticism, they would probably have skepticism. It's kind of a negative feel. None of the other ones even come close to a negative feel. And we know that these scientists would have a negative feel towards this book. So it's a good way to look at it. Let's go to number 7. Again, we ignore the answer choices. And we try to answer in our own words first. James Austin in passage 2 would most likely respond to the assertion in lines 6 to 7 in passage 1 by, let's go remind ourselves what the assertion was. This approach may work beautifully within the scope of science that the questions that science can answer, but life is a far richer tapestry than the threads of logic alone can weave. This is the part of passage 1 that seems to be criticizing science. James Austin, after his little experience, probably would agree with it too. So James Austin probably would say it's a good assertion. So let's look for the answers and see what even comes close to that idea, being a good assertion. So agreeing and citing his own experience as evidence, possibly, let's leave it. Agreeing and citing specific scientific findings as proof. On our first pass, let's leave it. We'll be critical later. But A and B both have this agreeing idea. C, declining to offer an opinion. He does have an opinion, so no. D, disagreeing and citing the specific beliefs of most. He wouldn't disagree. E, disagreeing and citing, again, he wouldn't disagree. So it's either A and B. Let's focus on the difference. The difference is citing his own experience or citing specific scientific findings to support why he agrees. Well, if we read through passage 2, there was no mention of any scientific findings, so B just, even if you wanted it to be true, it can't be true. It's not supported by the passage. So that's the part of B that makes it wrong. It would have to be A. So we circle A and get another point. Let's go to number 8. Again, try to answer in our own words here. The author of passage 1 would most likely characterize the insights mentioned in passage 2, line 20 as. So passage 1 author, it's just a broad view. We'll just take the main idea that we had for him. This question is not asking anything specific about passage 1. It's asking just about passage 1 in general. That means you use the main idea about that passage when you're thinking about it. It does ask us to focus on insights, though, in line 20. So let's go see what those insights are. Remember, we got to read around it sometimes to get a context. So he suddenly shed his formerly unshakable assumption that he was an individual, separated from the rest of the world by a skin suit. Within seconds, other insights dawned. So more insights came to him. And what types of insights were they talking about here? They're talking about non-science insights. Well, passage 1 agreed. Those exist. So we could say he most likely characterizes them as things that are legitimate. They exist. So let's look at the answers and see what we should consider. Mystical experiences that have little relevance. He probably doesn't think they have little relevance. Truths that can be arrived at only through rigorous scientific studies. The first part's okay, like a truth. Maybe he would agree with it. But then they throw in this whole thing about it can only be arrived at through rigorous scientific studies. Remember, we don't normally like the word only. It's one of our cautionary words. And indeed, in this case, it's a good reason to cross it off. He certainly doesn't think it can be arrived at only through scientific studies. He probably thinks the other way, in fact. So probably not B. Potentially valuable perceptions that most scientists would not consider legitimate. It could be that. Like, again, it works. It has like the first part of B, but it doesn't go wrong. Let's go to D. Sensory impressions that are unlikely to yield meaningful information. He probably doesn't think it's unlikely to yield meaningful information. Again, he likes these insights. That's the relationship between the passages. Personal experiences that scientists should not attempt to study. He never gave us a recommendation on whether or not scientists should or should not attempt to study this. Remember, should is, again, one of our cautionary words. So only and should, some of our cautionary words. And those are reasons to cross off two of the choices. All we have left is C, and C is definitely what passage 1 would be thinking about, those insights. They could be valuable, and most scientists would just dismiss them, unfortunately. And let's look at the last question. Again, we ignore the answer choices. And I do mean that. The day of the test, cover your answers. Don't let them influence you. That's why we cover them together here. Let's try to predict our answer. Unlike passage 1, passage 2 makes use of. Well, passage 1 talks pretty generally, right? Passage 2 brought up a specific guy. That's the biggest difference that kind of stands out. That might be what they're asking, maybe not. But passage 2 seems to make use of an example. Would be a good kind of prediction for this. Let's consider the answers. Generalization, they both seem to make generalizations, talking about scientists in general. Anecdote, it's like another word for example, so that could work. Figurative language, there's no really figurative language in either of them, so not really. Literary allusion, certainly not alluding to anything. Technical jargon, there's no jargon anywhere. So it would have to be B, and that's what we kind of predicted. So this is how we'd want to approach SAT reading passages, the dual short passage. You read the whole thing, you get the main idea of each, you find the relationship, and you do the questions. They can be quick and they can be straightforward. You continue, just like in previous passages, to reference old parts of the passage. You go back and you look every time that they reference something specific. You don't want to just rely on your memory. You have to rely on what's specifically said. But other than that, they're not drastically different. They just have these extra relationship questions.